The late afternoon sun warmed the cobblestones of the town square, turning them a cheerful gold. It was market day, and the air buzzed with 1,000 different things all happening at once. Farmers hawked their freshly picked vegetables, their voices booming over the happy chatter of shoppers. The sweet smell of Mrs. Higgins' famous apple pies mingled with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil clinging to the farmer's boots. Brightly colored fabrics billowed from stalls, catching the breeze like playful flags. A juggler, with a painted smile and nimble fingers, tossed bright red balls high in the air, drawing gasps and cheers from a small crowd. Little dogs yapped excitedly, weaving between legs laden with baskets overflowing with goods. A barrel organ wheezed out a jaunty tune, slightly off-key but full of life. The square was a feast for the senses, a vibrant tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells. It was the kind of place where you could easily lose yourself for an afternoon, happily soaking up the atmosphere. Old men sat on benches, whittling wood and watching the world go by with knowing smiles. Children chased pigeons across the square, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone buildings that surrounded it. Even the pigeons seemed to enjoy the commotion, strutting about with puffed-up chests as if they owned the place. The air crackled with a carefree energy, a sense of community and shared joy. It was a perfect day for a market, and the town square was alive with its usual cheerful chaos. But soon, a different kind of order would arrive, disrupting the joyful scene in a way no one expected. A shift was coming, heralded by the distant, rhythmic beat of a drum. The cheerful chaos was about to meet a wall of discipline and, eventually, a lesson in respect. Even before the first notes of a brass horn echoed through the square, a different kind of energy was already brewing. Near the fountain, a group of teenagers leaned against its stone rim, their laughter cutting through the general market noise. There was Maya, always quick with a joke and sporting bright pink streaks in her dark hair. Beside her stood Liam, tall and lanky, perpetually trying to suppress a grin that threatened to split his face in two. Rounding out the trio was Chloe, the most observant of the group, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and always ready with a witty comeback. They were the kind of teens who knew everyone and everything that was going on in town. Not troublemakers exactly, but definitely not angels either. Their days were filled with harmless pranks, whispered secrets, and the endless pursuit of amusement. They thrived on poking fun at the mundane, finding humor in the everyday absurdities of small-town life. Maya, the undisputed leader of the group, was currently mimicking Mr. Abernathy, the baker, attempting to imitate his booming voice as he advertised his sourdough bread. Liam and Chloe dissolved into giggles, their shoulders shaking with laughter. Chloe then countered with an impression of Mrs. Gable, the librarian, shushing noisy children with a dramatic flourish. They weren't trying to be mean-spirited. Their mockery was more like a playful game, a way to pass the time and bond with each other. They were young, carefree, and brimming with the confidence of youth. They hadn't yet learned the full weight of words, or the sting of disrespect. But their carefree afternoon of light-hearted teasing was about to take an unexpected turn. The distant drumming grew louder, and the teenagers, oblivious to the approaching formality, continued their playful banter, unaware of the silent storm brewing on the horizon. The drumming grew steadily louder, no longer a distant thrum but a clear, insistent rhythm that vibrated through the cobblestones. The market chatter began to subside, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Heads turned towards the main street, where the first glimpse of scarlet uniforms appeared. The town guard, in their full regalia, were marching into the square. They moved with a precision that was almost unnerving, each step perfectly synchronized, each head held high. Sunlight glinted off the polished brass of their instruments, reflecting in the stern faces of the musicians. Their uniforms were immaculate, a vibrant splash of red against the muted tones of the town square. White gloves gleamed as they gripped their instruments, and polished black boots shone with each step. Leading the formation was a tall man, his chest adorned with medals that caught the light. He held a gleaming silver baton, which he twirled with practiced ease. Behind him, rows of guardsmen marched in perfect formation, their faces set in expressions of unwavering focus. The air crackled with a sense of discipline and authority. The band struck up a march, a stirring melody that filled the square. It was a song of patriotism and pride, a celebration of the town's history and heritage. The sound was powerful and resonant, drowning out the last vestiges of the market's cheerful chaos. The jugglers stopped juggling, the dogs ceased their yapping, and even the pigeons took flight, startled by the sudden change in atmosphere. The town guard had arrived, bringing with them a sense of order and formality that stood in stark contrast to the light-hearted mood that had prevailed just moments before. It was a clash of energies, the playful irreverence of youth meeting the unwavering discipline of tradition. And the teenagers by the fountain were about to find themselves squarely in the middle of it. At first, the teenagers were merely amused. The sight of the rigidly marching guardsmen, their faces so serious and their movements so perfectly synchronized, struck them as unintentionally funny. Maya stifled a giggle, nudging Liam with her elbow. He bit his lip, trying to suppress a grin, but a snort of laughter escaped him anyway. Chloe, ever the observant one, noticed the way the sunlight glinted off the tuba player's bald head and whispered a witty remark to Maya about it resembling a polished egg. Their initial amusement quickly morphed into something a little more mischievous. As the band played on, their jokes became bolder, their whispers louder. Maya started mimicking the exaggerated marching style, exaggerating her steps and swinging her arms wildly. Liam joined in, pretending to play an imaginary trumpet, puffing out his cheeks and making comical noises. Chloe, not to be outdone, began composing ridiculous lyrics to the patriotic tune, singing them under her breath just loud enough for her friends to hear. They weren't trying to cause any real harm, but they were definitely pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Their laughter echoed through the square, mixing with the music in a jarring and disrespectful way. A few of the shoppers glanced their way, frowning slightly, but the teenagers were too caught up in their own amusement to notice. The music, intended to inspire pride and respect, was now being used as a backdrop for their silly antics. The contrast between the solemnity of the occasion and their light-hearted mockery was becoming increasingly obvious. They were teetering on the edge of causing a real disturbance, their youthful exuberance threatening to spill over into outright disrespect. And as the music swelled to a crescendo, their laughter grew louder still, drawing the attention of someone who wouldn't find their antics so amusing. Standing at the head of the formation, a figure of quiet authority, was Sergeant Major Thomas. He was a man etched with the stories of countless parades and long years of service. His uniform, though as immaculate as the others, bore subtle signs of wear, the brass slightly tarnished, the fabric softened by time. His face, weathered and lined, spoke of sun and wind, of long days spent drilling recruits and upholding tradition. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, were the most striking feature. They had seen everything, it seemed, from the innocent excitement of new recruits to the somber farewells of departing soldiers. They were eyes that could command respect without uttering a single word. For now, however, those eyes were fixed forward, focused on maintaining the precision of the marching band. He had heard the muffled laughter, the snorts, and the not-so-subtle imitations. He knew exactly where it was coming from. A younger sergeant might have stopped the music, issued a reprimand, or even called for the teens to be removed from the square. But Sergeant Major Thomas was not a younger sergeant. He had learned over the years that sometimes the most effective response was no response at all. At least, not yet. He knew that a direct confrontation would only escalate the situation, drawing more attention to the teenagers and disrupting the performance even further. He also knew that youthful exuberance, however misplaced, was often fleeting. He hoped that the teens would eventually tire of their game and quiet down on their own. But as their laughter grew louder, more insistent, and more openly disrespectful, a subtle shift occurred in the sergeant major's demeanor. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and a flicker of something akin to annoyance crossed his weathered face. The time for patience was coming to an end. The moment for quiet correction was fast approaching. The square, still filled with music, was about to witness the power of a single, well-aimed glare. The music continued, a valiant attempt to maintain its proud, unwavering rhythm. But the teenager's laughter had become a persistent counterpoint, a discordant melody that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed harmony. The trombone player, a young man barely out of his teens himself, stumbled slightly on a high note, his face flushing with embarrassment. The drummer, usually so confident, faltered for a split second, missing a beat. Even the conductor, despite his years of experience, seemed to lose a fraction of his composure. The townsfolk, initially enjoying the performance, began to shift uncomfortably. The laughter was no longer a minor annoyance. It was a blatant act of disrespect, a challenge to the authority of the guard and a disruption to the peace of the square. Whispers of disapproval rippled through the crowd. "Those youngsters are going too far," one woman muttered, shaking her head. "They should have more respect," another added, her voice laced with indignation. The sergeant major could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken disapproval directed not only at the teenagers but also, subtly, at him. As the leader of the guard, it was his responsibility to maintain order and decorum. He knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. The music reached a particularly rousing passage, a series of powerful chords that were meant to evoke feelings of patriotism and pride. But the teenager's laughter rose above it, a mocking echo that undermined the music's intended effect. Maya was now doing an exaggerated version of a salute, her eyes rolling comically. Liam was pretending to conduct the band with a stolen breadstick, his movements jerky and absurd. Chloe was making faces at the tuba player, trying to make him laugh. The sergeant major's hand tightened on his baton. His patience had finally reached its limit. The moment of reckoning was at hand. The sergeant major slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the square, seemingly taking in the entire scene. But his focus narrowed, honing in on the group of teenagers by the fountain. His eyes, usually a calm and steady blue, now held a glint of steel. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice, didn't even twitch a muscle in his face, save for the subtle tightening of his lips. His gaze lingered on Maya, the apparent ringleader, her face flushed with laughter, her eyes sparkling with mischief. He saw the way she egged on her friends, encouraging their disruptive behavior. He noted the breadstick clutched in Liam's hand, the ridiculous faces Chloe was making. He took it all in, cataloging their actions, measuring their disrespect. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on Maya's eyes. It wasn't an angry glare, not yet. It was more of a calculation, a silent assessment. He was weighing his options, considering the most effective way to restore order. His gaze intensified, becoming a focused beam of disapproval. It was a look that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. The corners of his mouth turned down almost imperceptibly. He seemed to be looking through Maya, seeing past her youthful exuberance to the core of her behavior. It was a look that penetrated, that judged, that demanded respect. He held her gaze for only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. In those few seconds, Maya's laughter faltered. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She suddenly became aware of the weight of his disapproval, the force of his authority. The music swelled, reaching a crescendo of trumpets and drums. But Maya barely heard it. All she could feel was the sergeant major's gaze, boring into her, silencing her, judging her. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to apologize, to shrink away, to disappear. The game was no longer fun. The laughter had died in her throat. The sergeant major's glare was about to be unleashed. It was as if all the weight of his years of service, all the discipline he had instilled in countless recruits, all the respect he had earned through unwavering dedication, was concentrated into that single searing look. It wasn't just a glare. It was a silent command, an unspoken reprimand that cut through the air like a physical force. His blue eyes, now narrowed to slits, seemed to burn with an inner fire. They were no longer just observing. They were judging, condemning, silencing. The lines around his eyes deepened, etched by years of experience and unwavering resolve. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, creating a V-shaped crease above his nose that added to the intensity of his expression. The color in his cheeks seemed to deepen, a subtle flush that hinted at the barely contained anger simmering beneath the surface. His jaw was set, his lips pressed tightly together, as if he were holding back a torrent of words that would shatter the fragile peace of the square. But he didn't need words. His eyes said it all. It was a look that could stop a charging soldier in his tracks, that could silence a room full of shouting recruits, that could command respect from even the most hardened veterans. It was a look that spoke of unwavering authority, of unshakable conviction, of a lifetime spent upholding the values of duty and honor. And now that look was directed at Maya, Liam, and Chloe. The full force of the sergeant major's disapproval crashed over them like a tidal wave, silencing their laughter, extinguishing their mischief, and replacing it with a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The music, though still playing, seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was the sergeant major's glare, a force so powerful that it could silence an entire square in an instant. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, cutting off the flow of laughter and mischief. Maya's hand, which had been raised in a mocking salute, dropped limply to her side. Liam's breadstick, poised mid-air in a ridiculous conducting gesture, fell to the ground with a soft thud. Chloe's face, which had been contorted in a comical grimace, smoothed out, her eyes widening in stunned silence. Their laughter, which had been so loud and pervasive just moments before, vanished without a trace, replaced by a profound and unsettling quiet. It was as if the very air around them had been sucked dry, leaving a vacuum of silence that amplified the sound of the music and the hushed whispers of the crowd. The change in their expressions was equally dramatic. The mischievous sparkle in their eyes was replaced by a dazed, almost frightened look. Their faces, which had been flushed with amusement, turned pale. They stood frozen, like deer caught in the headlights, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to even breathe properly. The sergeant major's glare had not only silenced them, it had paralyzed them, stripping them of their confidence, their humor, and their sense of invincibility. They were no longer the carefree, mischievous teenagers who had been mocking the guard just moments before. They were now just three young people, humbled and ashamed, caught in the unforgiving beam of the sergeant major's disapproval. The music, which had been a backdrop to their antics, now seemed to press in on them, amplifying their discomfort. Every note, every chord, every beat of the drum seemed to accuse them of their disrespect, their immaturity, their lack of judgment. The square, which had been a playground for their laughter, now felt like a courtroom, with the sergeant major as the stern and unyielding judge. The stunned silence was deafening. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the now slightly wavering notes of the town guard's march. The trombone player, still flustered from his earlier mistake, missed another note, his face reddening further. The drummer, sensing the shift in atmosphere, tightened his grip on his sticks, his knuckles turning white. Even the conductor, despite his best efforts to maintain his composure, couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. The sergeant major, however, remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the teenagers. He held their attention captive, refusing to release them from the weight of his disapproval. He wanted them to understand the gravity of their actions, the disrespect they had shown to the guard, to the town, and to themselves. The crowd, sensing the tension, fell silent as well. All eyes were now on the teenagers, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and a hint of schadenfreude. They had been entertained by the teenagers' antics, but now they were witnessing their downfall, their public shaming. Maya, Liam, and Chloe stood frozen, their minds racing, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so utterly and completely ashamed. They longed to disappear, to rewind time, to undo their foolish behavior. But there was no escape. They were trapped in the spotlight, forced to endure the weight of the sergeant major's gaze and the silent condemnation of the crowd. The music, which had once been a source of amusement, now felt like a relentless interrogation. Each note a question, each chord an accusation. The silence between the notes was even worse, a deafening void that amplified their guilt and their remorse. The air was thick with unspoken words, with unacknowledged apologies, with the heavy burden of regret. The square held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence lingered, an oppressive blanket that smothered the square. It wasn't just the absence of laughter. It was the absence of almost all sound. The usual market day noises, the chatter of vendors, the clatter of carts, the barking of dogs, had all but disappeared, replaced by a hushed expectancy. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, cooing softly to themselves instead of strutting about with their usual bravado. The teenagers stood motionless, the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing down on them like a physical burden. They could feel the eyes of the townsfolk boring into them, judging them, condemning them. It was a collective stare that amplified their shame and intensified their discomfort. Maya felt a blush creeping up her neck, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She wanted to look away, to break the sergeant major's gaze, but she couldn't. His eyes held her captive, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. She could feel Liam and Chloe shifting nervously beside her, their discomfort mirroring her own. Liam shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed on the cobblestones. He wished he could sink into the ground, to disappear from sight. He had never felt so foolish, so immature, so utterly and completely humiliated. He could hear the whispers of the crowd, the barely concealed snickers, and the murmurs of disapproval. Chloe, usually so quick-witted and confident, found herself at a loss for words. She couldn't think of a single thing to say, a single joke to crack, a single witty remark to deflect the tension. She just wanted to be anywhere else, doing anything else. The sergeant major's gaze finally shifted, sweeping across the crowd, silencing their whispers and reminding them of the solemnity of the occasion. He then turned his attention back to the band, giving a subtle nod, a silent command to continue. The music swelled, filling the void, but the oppressive quiet remained, a lingering reminder of the power of the sergeant major's glare and the teenager's moment of shame. As the music swelled once more, filling the square with its stirring melody, a barely perceptible change occurred in the sergeant major's expression. The harsh lines around his eyes softened ever so slightly, and the corners of his mouth twitched upwards in the faintest hint of a smile. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there nonetheless. It was the expression of a man who had achieved his goal, who had restored order without resorting to shouting or reprimands, who had taught a valuable lesson without uttering a single word. It was the expression of a leader who understood the power of restraint, the effectiveness of quiet authority, and the importance of allowing young people to learn from their mistakes. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to lecture them or scold them or punish them. His glare had been enough. It had been a silent but powerful message that had resonated deep within their hearts, leaving a lasting impression that would shape their behavior for years to come. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet respect. The townsfolk, reassured by the sergeant major's subtle gesture, turned their attention back to the music, allowing the melody to wash over them, cleansing the square of its earlier discord. The sergeant major's gaze swept across the band, ensuring that they were back on track, their performance flawless, their demeanor unwavering. He then turned his attention back to the teenagers, his eyes conveying a silent message of forgiveness and understanding. He wasn't angry, he wasn't resentful, he wasn't holding a grudge. He simply wanted them to learn from their mistake, to grow from the experience, and to become better citizens of the town. The lesson had been delivered, and it had been received. Now it was time to move on. The music surged back to life, stronger and more confident than before. It was as if the brief interruption had only served to amplify their resolve, to strengthen their commitment to their performance. The trombone player hit his high notes with renewed vigor, his face no longer flushed with embarrassment, but beaming with pride. The drummer pounded out the rhythm with unwavering precision, his knuckles no longer white but flushed with exertion. Even the conductor seemed to stand taller, his baton moving with newfound authority. The music filled the square, washing away the last vestiges of tension and replacing it with a sense of shared pride and patriotism. The townsfolk tapped their feet, clapped their hands, and sang along to the familiar melody, their faces alight with joy. The focus had shifted completely, from the teenagers' antics to the guard's performance, from disrespect to reverence. The guard marched on, their steps perfectly synchronized, their uniforms gleaming in the afternoon sun. They were a symbol of the town's history, its traditions, and its values. And now, they were once again being celebrated and honored by the community. The sergeant major watched with satisfaction, his eyes sweeping across the square, taking in the scene of unity and harmony. He had accomplished what he had set out to do. He had restored order, he had taught a valuable lesson, and he had ensured that the guard's performance would be remembered for all the right reasons. The music reached a crescendo, a triumphant finale that sent shivers down the spines of the listeners. The crowd erupted in applause, showering the guard with their appreciation. The teenagers, standing silently by the fountain, joined in the applause, their hands clapping softly, their faces still flushed with shame but also with a newfound respect. The performance was over, but the lesson had just begun. Standing by the fountain, Maya, Liam, and Chloe watched the remainder of the performance in silence. The laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet contemplation. They no longer saw the guard as a source of amusement, but as a symbol of something larger than themselves, something worthy of respect. Maya found herself focusing on the faces of the guardsmen, noticing the lines of dedication etched around their eyes, the pride in their posture, the unwavering commitment to their performance. She realized that they weren't just playing music. They were upholding a tradition, honoring their town, and serving their community. Liam, still clutching the remnants of his breadstick, stared at the ground, replaying the events of the past few minutes in his mind. He felt a pang of guilt for his disrespectful behavior, a sense of shame for the way he had mocked the guard and disrupted their performance. He understood now that his actions had consequences, that his laughter had hurt others, and that his immaturity had caused him to lose the respect of the community. Chloe, ever the observant one, noticed the way the townsfolk were applauding, their faces filled with genuine appreciation. She realized that the guard's performance meant something to them, that it was a source of pride and joy, and that her laughter had diminished their experience. She felt a deep sense of remorse for her actions, a longing to apologize, to make amends. They didn't speak, but they communicated with each other through silent glances, through subtle nods, through unspoken words of understanding and regret. They had learned a valuable lesson, a lesson that couldn't be taught in a classroom or read in a book. They had learned the importance of respect, the power of authority, and the consequences of their actions. They had learned that laughter can be a source of joy, but it can also be a weapon of disrespect. And they had learned that a single glare, delivered with authority and conviction, can silence an entire square and change the course of their lives. As the final notes of the march faded away, the town guard turned in perfect unison and began their procession out of the square. The crowd, still applauding, parted to make way for them, their faces filled with gratitude and admiration. The sergeant major, his face impassive but his eyes twinkling with satisfaction, led the way, his silver baton gleaming in the fading sunlight. The teenagers watched in silence as the guard marched away, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. They were no longer the center of attention, but they were still very much aware of the impact their actions had had on the events of the afternoon. As the last of the guardsmen disappeared from sight, Maya, Liam, and Chloe exchanged a knowing glance. It was a look that spoke volumes, a look that acknowledged their shared experience, their shared shame, and their shared understanding of the lesson they had learned. A long moment of silence hung in the air before Liam finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wow," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was intense." Chloe nodded in agreement. "I don't think I'll ever look at a marching band the same way again," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Maya, the last to speak, looked at her friends, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. "He didn't even have to say a word," she said. referring to the sergeant major. That's the power of respect, I guess. They stood in silence for a few more moments, contemplating the events of the afternoon. The market day noises began to return, the vendors hawking their wares, the children chasing pigeons, the dogs barking playfully. But the square felt different now, changed by the events that had unfolded. As they turned to leave, heading towards home, Maya paused for a moment, looking back at the now empty square. She knew that they would never forget this day, that the sergeant major's glare would forever be etched in their memories, a constant reminder of the importance of respect and the consequences of their actions. The lesson had been learned, and the teenagers were ready to move on, forever changed by the power of a single, well-aimed glare.